the main issue that I think has bothered a lot of people for a very long time is that at least since the collapse of the USSR, the weakening of the confidence of the third world as a political project, we've all been firehosed by Western thought. There was like a real drive and push from the US academy, from European academy to push postmodern ideas on us, all kinds of different fashions and fads. It's a curiosity of, and I'm very much at the heart of this particular debate and dispute on the African continent. It's a curiosity that on the African continent, students in universities and colleges start learning economics by a paradigm that makes absolutely no sense for the continent. So the start of the first chapter is about the so-called utility calculations, demand and supply calculations, the market, and so on. But in fact, in an African college, let's say in Lusaka, Zambia, if you are a student at the University of Zambia, the first day in an economics class should be, how can Zambia, a rich country with all these resources, the copper, mainly the copper, let's just take the copper, this rich country, how can it have poverty? How can the people be poor? The principal question on the African continent for many countries is not what is demand, what is supply, but how is it that rich countries can be poor? And so Tricontinental was started as an initiative of social and political movements to effectively change the terms of our intellectual discussion. We don't want the terms to be set at Harvard University or at Oxford University or even at the Sorbonne, Buna. We want the terms to be set for African, Asian, Latin American students so that their realities are at the center of the debate and dispute for themselves. I mean, Mona, let me just pick up on the point about Nkrumah, because this for me is a very sore spot. Nkrumah has been truly suppressed. He is one of the greatest Marxist intellectuals from the African continent, and he is not treated as an intellectual. He's treated, I'm sorry to say, by scholarship that largely comes from the North as a dictator. Kwame Nkrumah was an extraordinary man. He basically fought to become a young teacher, struggled to develop his own abilities to teach, to formulate his understanding of the Gold Coast under British colonialism. Nkrumah developed an anti-colonial attitude. He was able to win a scholarship to go to the United States to study in Philadelphia. But, people say it's when he was in the US that he got radicalized. Not true. On the way to the United States, when he's in England, it's 1936, and he hears the news that Italy has invaded Ethiopia. And he describes the revulsion that he feels, because Ethiopia was one of the few countries that had not been taken over by European colonialism. And he was very angry. He said, I wanted to rip the newsstand down. I was that angry. Goes to the United States, studies in the US, makes contact with black radicals and others in the United States, returns to Britain, helps W.E.B. Du Bois and others with the 1945 Pan-African Conference in Manchester, then goes back home to the Gold Coast, gets a little car, drives to almost every village and town in the country, giving speeches about the dignity of the people of the Gold Coast, builds a political movement, is arrested, thrown into prison. From prison in 1951, he wins a landslide in an election for Accra, the Accra seat to the assembly. He becomes the leader of a partial government. He brings this government eventually to power in a independence movement in 1959. And then Nkrumah sets his sights on not only building this great country of Ghana, with new projects for electrification, literacy, and so on, but Nkrumah understands that Ghana cannot be alone, and he pushes a Pan-African vision. It is because of Nkrumah that people like Lumumba and others who come to Accra for a conference on Pan-Africanism, he meets Fanon, he meets Lumumba. Lumumba says that Nkrumah is my mentor. He mentors a number of that generation. It's because of Nkrumah that in 1963, the Organization of African Unity is created in Addis Ababa. Now it's called the African Union. And when he is couped during a trip to China, they try to wipe out his heritage. His statues are dropped. A deep, CIA move comes to invalidate the ideas and legacy of Kwame Nkrumah. You travel today to countries in Africa, people just don't know the importance of Kwame Nkrumah to the entire project, modern project of African liberation. People here, Rodney and others are getting, lifted out. But Nkrumah built a state. Nkrumah attempted to build a continent. This guy is extraordinary. And I think and I don't want to sound like a nutcase conspiratorial person, but I feel like it's a pretty deliberate strategy to prevent young people from reading, for instance, Neocolonialism, one of the best books about imperialism after 1945. It's an extraordinary book. People are just not driven to read some of his later books about the betrayals of colonialism and neocolonialism, his frustration with the electoral route, his book on guerrilla warfare. I mean, some of the stuff is out of date. You're not going to go and fight a guerrilla war today. It's going to be difficult. But these are object lessons in how to understand power. And I feel very strongly that, the quote unquote bringing back of the full history and legacy of Kwame Nkrumah is so important for all of us, not only on the continent, but across the former third world. And indeed, Kalonji, what you were talking about earlier, and what Gerald Horne was talking about in his quote, saying, we look abroad to get strategy. Also for people in the United States, very important to reflect on what Nkrumah says. He'll teach people about not falling for the trickery of imperialism within the United States. People saying, well, Kamala Harris would have been a great president. I doubt it. Nkrumah would have slapped you for saying that.
If you can tell the people, what is hyper imperialism, and how does it differ from imperialism as we generally know it, right? As we've come to know it in today's time.
Well, let's just take an example. Give me an opportunity to talk about a story that I just like to talk about, which is what was done to Libya. In Libya, contagiously, because this was a contagion after the protests in Tunisia in 2010, in Egypt and so on, section of the law faculty and others in Benghazi started a protest. And they said, we want more freedom and rights and liberties, just like, law faculties would do in other countries. A dispute begins with the government in Tripoli, led in a peculiar way by Colonel Muammar al-Gaddafi. And then a section of the military in Benghazi defects to the rebellion. Mr. Gaddafi and his son, Saif al-Islam Gaddafi, send their troops along, and at the cities of Ajtabia, at the northern end of the Mediterranean, these two forces collide. There's, in fact, air fire happening and so on. The Saudi media, a newspaper called Al Arabiya, starts to say that genocide is being conducted in Libya. And the Western press picks this up, and people hate Gaddafi because Gaddafi used to say to the Saudi king at the Arab League meetings, you were made by the British. He would say to the Qataris, you are a dog of the Americans. That's how Gaddafi talked. People hated him. Everybody ganged up against this guy. They said there's a genocide. The Americans and French went to the UN Security Council. They first passed a resolution saying nobody should arm either side. Okay, nobody should arm either side. But then this was not good enough for the West. They went back with a resolution saying under Chapter 7 of the UN Charter, which allows armed force, that all member states should go in to create a no-fly zone. Remember the phrase, no-fly zone. There should be no aerial firing, because remember, both sides had sections of the Air Force. France and the United States used that resolution. 1973 is the number of the resolution from 2011. They used that resolution to just go in and destroy Libya. The African Union had assembled a group of heads of states, including Jacob Zuma of South Africa, a large country, important country. They were all ready to fly to Tripoli and fly to Benghazi to bring the temperature down. They were following a mandate of the African Union, which had given them a mandate to bring peace in Libya, which, let's not forget, is on the African continent. And therefore, the African Union has a mandate. But no, the French warned the African Union, if that plane takes off, it could get shot down. So it can't take off. They knew that the African Union was ready to go and negotiate. They said no. And they just went in and barbarically, brutally, dangerously destroyed the country. They violated the mandate of the UN, which just said no-fly zone. People can go and read UN Resolution 1973. I wrote a book about this called Arab Spring, Libyan Winter. This is a great example of hyper-imperialism. Here is the West, dangerous. Anything happens, they reach for the gun. I mean, this is the Wild West. 73% of global military spending is spent by the United States and its allies. In Niger, where Abdul Rahman Tichani is now the head of government, there was a coup d'etat. One of the reasons there was a coup d'etat is in the city of Agadez, which is not the capital, but a very large city in central Niger. There is a giant US drone base. Most people in the United States do not know that they spent hundreds of millions of US taxpayer money to build a giant drone base in Niger. For what? Effectively, to spy on poor, middle class, in some cases, African men, because I've actually traveled with them that route from Agadez to Sabah, Libya. Poor middle class African men get on Toyota trucks. I've never seen a woman do this crossing. They're all young men, put on dark glasses to shield themselves from the Sahara, and these US drones track them in order to stop these trucks getting to Libya and therefore trying to enter Europe. This is a hostile act by the United States and the French military, which operated until recently in Niger. This is hyper-imperialism. Why is it okay for the French to have military bases in the Sahel? Why is it okay for the United States to actually take over Terminal 1 in Accra International Airport so that US troops, they fly their planes, land on Ghanaian soil, Ghana, liberated by the movement led by Kwame Nkrumah? US planes can land in Ghana, and the soldiers walk into Terminal 1. They don't show their passport to anybody. They don't show any ID cards. They can walk into Ghana. Nobody else can do that. If you're a diplomat, you have to show a passport. US troops just walk in. This is hyper-imperialism. Israel has just seized a part of Syria that is larger than the size of Gaza. They've just gone in and taken it over. Nobody cares. In our institute, we call this the International Division of Labor. The International Division of Humanity. When, for instance, Palestinians are being killed, or when children in Sudan are being killed in a terrible outside provoked war, when children are being killed in the Great Lakes War in Africa, that's okay. They are not children. When one Ukrainian child dies, everybody's hue and cry. A white child has been killed. We call this the International Division of Humanity. And indeed, hyper-imperialism operates like that. I mean, if the Chinese, for instance, had the temerity to, even bring one of their warships somewhere 200 nautical miles from the US coastline, the US would go nuts. But the United States warships, armed and ready with nuclear weapons, constantly harass the Chinese at the territorial, or not territorial, at the naval limit, at the water line, constantly harass them. And this is perfectly okay. Hyper-imperialism is this attitude. Reach for the gun whenever you feel like you want to. Doesn't even have to be a conflict. I mean, in Libya, it was hardly the worst conflict on the African continent or anywhere in the world at that time. And yet they destroyed the country, still not recovered. That was in 2011. We are almost into 2025. The country has been destroyed, its institutions destroyed. At the time I wrote, it takes 100 years to build a state. You can destroy it in an afternoon. It's not going to get rebuilt that quickly. It doesn't happen like that. We've seen what has been done to the state formation in the Democratic Republic of Congo. They have destroyed elements of the state which Lumumba could have constructed in such a powerful way for the people. It's going to take a long time to recover sovereignty for that country. This is hyper imperialism. Reach for the gun, international division of humanity, decadent, because these leaders, the Macrons, the Trumps, they don't have any ideas. They just have force, power, vulgarity. They are vulgar people. They don't want to solve the problems of humanity. They've forgotten that the word human belongs in the name humanity.
Can you elaborate on how that state of open hostility has been deployed in the context of the current genocides?
I mean, let's first take a not genocidal example, and then we see how ugly this is. A few years ago, through a long process of debate and discussion, the governments of Zambia and the Democratic Republic of Congo agreed to jointly process their lithium and other metals and minerals that they have. And they were going to get some assistance from China, but it was not a Chinese joint venture. This was a Zambia DRC project. Eventually, these two countries wanted to build a car. That was the idea. The inspiration came from Bolivia, which during Evo Morales' time processed lithium and built not only a lithium battery, but also a little car, a very small little car that's good for the Bolivian terrain. The DRC and Zambia, even though ruled by governments of the right, let's say, understood that they wanted to control their development. Okay, when they started to go down this path, the United States called upon African leaders to come to a US-Africa summit to be held in Washington, D.C. They didn't even hold it on the continent. They held it in D.C. They summoned the heads of government. So the heads of government, of course, when the emperor calls, you have to go and you have to bend your knee to Emperor Biden. Not sure which direction he's looking at, but you have to still go and bend your knee to the emperor. Anyway, people went. And at the side of that meeting and discussion, an announcement was made by Antony Blinken, Secretary of State. The United States, the DRC, Zambia, and Angola were going to jointly develop a project called the Lopito Corridor, where the resources of Zambia and the DRC were going to be partly processed and then shipped through Angola out to the United States, where the proper manufacturing would either take place or in Mexico. In other words, the United States just walked in to a sovereign project and hijacked it. This is the level of lack of both concern for the actual developments taking place on the continent, and it's actually an indicator of the poor journalism in the West, because this was barely reported in this way in the Western media. They were just reporting saying, what a great thing the United States is doing. It's going to help these Africans develop. But maybe the Africans don't need your help. Maybe they already have it together and you strong-armed them and said that if you don't come into this. And around this time, Angola basically walked out of the group of friends in defense of the UN Charter. The United States effectively told the Angolan government, if you don't come with us, we're going to squeeze you very hard. I find this is a very painful example, because this example condemns hundreds of millions of children on the African continent to starvation. That's actually what this press conference was about. Because if these countries had been able to industrialize the value chain, produced a small car, their parents of these children would have had decent jobs. They would have been able to earn enough living. The states would have perhaps collected revenue and built decent schools so that the children in the copper belt region of Zambia, under whose feet is the copper, would not be illiterate. The illiteracy rate is 60% in the copper belt region of Zambia. I mean, this deal by Blinken condemns, and I'm not exaggerating the numbers, hundreds of millions, because it's over generations. This is over generations. This is also a form of soft genocide. This is the soft genocide of imperialist policy on continents of Africa, Asia, Latin America. I mean, there is the hard genocide that is taking place in Palestine. Of course, that's a hot genocide. But then there's a cold genocide. these continents are struggling with a cold genocide. It is intolerable to me that generation after generation, we cannot transcend the extremely transcendable problem of hunger, inequality, poverty, illiteracy. These are transcendable problems. It is absolutely outrageous. And that's why I consider this a cold genocide. It's cold because you don't see it. There's no bomb falling in Zambia right now. That's a hot genocide. But it's a genocide no less. It's a cold genocide.